That was Walk With Me by Martha Bash. That was from the soundtrack from the movie called Selma. Hello there, YouTube, Facebook, social cam, social media, people out there. This is the Reverend Carrie Foster. Once again, I decided to make another video. This video is a video that today I made a decision to go to the movies today to see the motion picture film called Selma. The real reason why I decided to go and see this film Selma, because today is the 86th birthday of the great late civil rights leader, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is the greatest civil rights leader of all time. Today is his birthday. I decided to honor Dr. King and going and seeing this film, Selma. Selma is a must-see movie that we all need to go and to watch. This film is a true story of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and it is the 50th year anniversary for the march from Montgomery to Selma. This march was a march because more than 50 years ago that our ancestors was from the South was disallowed to vote. They didn't have no type of voting and economic privileges like white citizens in the South. And it was very fearful that white people didn't allow African Americans to vote. So Martin Luther King Jr. and several other civil rights leaders like the late Jimmy Lee Jackson, the Reverend Andrew Young, the Reverend Fred Shepworth, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, the Reverend Jose Williams, John Lewis, and many other civil rights leaders decided to fight for the advance of the voting privileges for African American men and women in the South. Now, this film, Selma, had an all-star cast in this film, starring David Oyelowo as Martin Luther King Jr., Carmen Electra as Coretta Scott King. Oprah Winfrey was in this film, and she also produced this film. She played as Annie Lee Cooper. Tim Ruckert as Alabama former Governor George Wallace, and Tom Wilkerson played as former President Lyndon B. Johnson. Also who starred in this movie was Common, and who also starred in the film as well is Cuba Gooding Jr. This film was a true story, and the true story of this movie was based off of the struggles of the 1960 civil rights movement. We come to ask the question, why didn't African Americans have the privileges to vote? The real reason why they didn't have the privileges to vote in the South, it was because of voting and economic equals power. And the power structure of America was based off of economic success and based off of voting power. When you receive the two mixed together, you can have power to end racial segregation. So if we have African Americans can vote and vote for their own political figures, that can interrupt with the political system of the South in ending racial segregation. And what racial segregation was the racial division between whites and blacks, or whites and colors, had unequal treatment by sitting on the back of the bus, by eating separate foods, by going to different restaurants, by sitting in the back of movie theaters, not having the right to vote. Racial segregation was a power structure, was created by whites to oppress African Americans politically and economically. So this whole movement was a very dangerous movement, and everybody in this movement was young. They was under 30 years old. Martin Luther King himself was a very young man, a very young, courageous man. Most of the people in the movement, they were young, they were militant, and they wanted to see changes in the South. Most white segregationists, especially former governor, Alabama's governor, George Wallace, was threatened about the voting rights, because he knew that if African Americans, or back then they called us niggers, or they called us colored folks, if colored folks had the same privilege of voting like the way white Southerners had, they can vote for their own political candidates, and they can abolish racial segregation and have integration, that whites and blacks and minorities and majorities can sit together, can eat together, they can vote together, they have the same privileges like all America have. And this movement became a threat towards the white establishment. So Martin Luther King had to call for a march, which this was a 55 dangerous, violent march. The first march was very unsuccessful because Governor George Wallace basically had the Alabama troops to guard the discriminators and to block them from marching. And he knew it was going to be blood was going to be shed. So Martin Luther King decided to turn around. So the first march didn't happen. The second march didn't happen. So King went back and forth, still talking to, negotiating with President Lyndon B. Johnson. And President Johnson was not putting the voting rights as a privilege at first. He was putting that as a back burner, saying, well, I already gave y'all colors y'all civil rights, and I want you to work with the poverty. But I'm hesitant. I'm not against it, but I'm very hesitant about signing another bill, and this bill is a bill that allows African Americans all over the South can vote, because it was against the law. he was hesitant about this at first, but Dr. King kept on going. He kept on pushing. He kept on demanding Johnson to sign this bill. So Martin had no other choice to, to go for a third march. This went into the Alabama State Supreme Court. They ruled and said that King and the civil rights people win, that they can march. And they went right back to the president and told President Johnson, we're still going to go ahead and march. We're still going to have this voting right, whether you like it or not. Johnson was in a lot of agony, but he finally came to his right senses and he decided to let them go ahead and they march. And the police at first was right at what they call the Edmonds Patterson's Bridge. They was right there. But the Alabama's state sheriffs gave the okay for them to go ahead and they can march. They called the march Bloody Sunday on the second Sunday in March in '65 because there were a lot of innocent men and women basically died, like Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was from Maryland, Alabama, and he was a deacon in the church and he was an activist. He ended up got beaten to death. It was a white woman from Detroit, Michigan. She would come down in her car from Detroit to Selma to Montgomery because she was an activist that supported the Voting Acts and she voted for civil rights as well too. She was shot and she was killed in her car. There were many men and women on that Bloody Sunday was killed. The biggest problem with this, that every time when they had a peaceful march, it was violence came. And this was a non-violent revolution. Was a non-violent revolution, but violence occurred into this march. After the march was a 54-mile crucial walk. The good thing that what they had food, they had shelter, they had drinks, they had entertainers, they had various of entertainers like Harry Belafonte went down there and sung. I heard that they had Lena Horns, they had Sammy Davis Jr., I heard there were several of Motown artists there like the Temptations, the Four Tops, Donna Ross and the Supremes was there. I heard it was many other activists, many actors was there, like Tony Bennett was there. So the movement was a integrated movement with all races and all colors. It really wasn't a movement just African Americans. It was a movement and a march where it was all colors. It was all religion because there were Jews there. There were Muslims. There were Catholics there. There were Protestants there. They were all marching in this march. And then when they finally arrived on the steps of the Capitol of Alabama in Montgomery, that President Johnson had no other choice but to sign the bill and says that voting is something shall not be tolerated by discrimination, that you are able to vote regardless of what your color, your religion, your race, or your ethnicity is. The bill was passed. It was successfully was passed. And the film showed coverage to coverage of the agony, the pain, the suffering that what our civil rights activists had to go through in their everyday life. Not just in the movement itself, but it also showed the everyday agony that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had to go through in his day-to-day life, not just as an activist and a leader, but in his personal life, because the FBI was so hateful, was so mean and so belligerent towards against him that they wanted to destroy the movement. And the way that they wanted to destroy the movement is to attack Dr. King's personal life and try to accuse him of being adultery. There were a lot of sex tapes were out there, was saying that Dr. King was going around having an extramarital affair against his wife Coretta, and he was going around from hotel to hotel, sleeping and having sex with this woman there, that woman there, to destroy their marriage, to destroy the movement. They couldn't find anything against King, so they try to trap him with a sex tape. They try to trap him that he was an adulterer. They try to trap him that he was a pimp. They try to trap him and say that he was a smoker, he was a drinker, and he's not worthy. This preacher, this nigga preacher wasn't worthy. He's Martin Luther Coon. That's what he was. But all of those allegations that they tried to say did not stop the movement, because this movement was a Christian movement, and anything that it have God in there and worship God like the way that the movement will, it will go forward. That God is a God of the oppressed. God loves all people, but God specially loves the people who have been oppressed. Over for 400 years that African Americans in this country has been oppressed. African Americans identify themselves with the Bible, with the Old Testament. They identify themselves with the book of Exodus, that when Moses freed the slaves, the Hebrew people, the Israelites against the Egyptians, and he said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Pharaoh was very hesitant towards it, like the same thing like George Wallace was. The Pharaoh was George Wallace. Bull Connor was George Wallace. Bull Connor, all of them was like the Pharaoh. And look at the way how God basically punished the Pharaoh with 10 plagues. The last plague that Pharaoh was punished with, according to the Bible, it was the plague of the firstborn male child must die. The Pharaoh's son died. So God is a God of the oppressed. So the civil rights movement was a Christian movement. It was a Christian movement that was won because Dr. King put God first. He put prayer first. He put nonviolence first. And anytime when you put prayer, you put God, you put prayer, you put nonviolence in your oppression, God will come and he will release you, because Jesus is the Lord of the God for the oppressed people. That's how the civil rights movement really won, and it really won this movement. So my review in this movie, Selma, I basically will give this movie an A- for great acting, great producing, great directing. They've showed the foot-to-foot coverage of the life and the agony of what Martin Luther King and his family had to go through. They showed about all of the civil rights activists that was killed. They honored John Lewis, who's now a great congressman from Atlanta. They basically showed the organization SNCC. And the very interesting thing about it, they had a little cameo appearance on the meeting of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, which traditionally Martin Luther King and Malcolm X did not see eye to eye on the movement, because Malcolm's approach was a more of a militant approach on separation. But when Malcolm left the Nation of Islam, he wanted to work with Dr. King. But sadly enough, a month before the march in February of '65, Malcolm X was gunned down in Harlem, New York. And he didn't get a chance to really to work with Dr. King in the effort of civil rights. So this movie should be a must-made film that you take your family, you take your friends, you take your significant others, go to this movie, get some popcorn, get some food, get something to eat while you watch this film, because this film is very, very tense film to see. They put a lot of energy, they put a lot of time, in this film. So I encourage all people to really to watch this film. This film is a 2.5 hour film, and it's a must-made film to watch and to encourage, and you will really will enjoy this. This song right here I'm playing, this is Common Song with John Legend. This song is the closing of the soundtrack from the movie Selma. I hope you enjoy this song, enjoy this video. This is the Reverend Carrie Foster. I'm the Associate Minister at Greater St. Matthew's Baptist Church in Holland Park, Michigan. My pastor is the Reverend D. Alexander Bullard. So I come to leave you to say that God loves you and I love you too. So go and see this movie, because this movie is a great music. God bless you. Enjoy this song.